Hello. I want to talk to you today about the experience of anxiety. Um, Something I think a lot of people experience in the context of this pandemic and in the context of isolation and so on. So I want to talk about that experience philosophically a little bit. So I'm going to describe a little bit what I think that experience is and what are some circumstances in which we have that experience. And then I'm going to give a philosophical analysis of it based primarily on Martin Heidegger's analysis of the experience of anxiety in his book Being and Time from 1927. Uh, and the overall point is that um, we often think of anxiety as a problem. We might even think of it as a mental illness or something like that. And it's something that we think, oh, it's a bad thing, I've got to get rid of it. What I want to do by using Heidegger's analysis is talk a little bit about how we might actually think of anxiety as a healthy thing and talk a little bit about um, specifically how that interpretation of anxiety could lead us to think about our current uh, global situation. Uh, so first, um, I'm gonna do two things. I'm gonna do two big things. I'm gonna describe it and then I'm gonna analyze it, and each of those will have two parts. I'm gonna just try to describe the basic experience, and then I'm gonna uh, sort of sort it out a little bit, and then in the second part, I'm going to talk a little bit about, as I said, why it might be healthy, and then have a section sort of talking about how to apply that to contemporary situation. So the experience of anxiety, if we had to describe it, I think probably most basically, it feels like a particular kind of unsettledness. And um, it's a way you feel unsettled, you feel like you can't quite be at home in circumstances. Um, and you can feel kind of disconnected and uncomfortable. And you can feel it in a small way. For example, maybe before a date you're anxious about, a date that might be kind of important, you feel a bit uptight, and that can lead you to feel like you can't settle into anything. To stick with that notion of unsettledness, you can't settle into any activity. You feel a little bit uncomfortable, but you can't really do anything about it. And you're just kind of waiting for that event to happen. That's a small one, but more importantly, you can also have experience it as something that basically defines how you're living. There, more obvious examples that I'm sure there are many, but more obvious examples of that would be what happens at the end of a substantial relationship. Um, Probably especially if the other person breaks up with you, and you suddenly really feel adrift, you feel lost. Um, Another example would be, I think a lot of people experience this, what they call a midlife crisis. Somewhere around, I don't know, the age 40, 50, somewhere in there. Well, probably not 40 exactly, probably a bit later, 45 or 50. Um, People can really pointedly feel like they're no longer that young person who used to exist, and they now feel like they're in kind of the second half of their life. And their death or their old age, probably especially death, feels real to them and sort of a thing coming up soon in the future in a way that it never did before. And they can also feel like, they're sort of done stuff they were going to do, and uh, and it's not working. It's the life isn't meaningful in the way they hoped it would be. Um, and that can produce a real state of anxiety too. Like I said, I'm sure there are lots and lots of important examples, but I thought of those as three fairly familiar examples we could recognize. The small example of feeling anxious before a date, but then the more serious ones of the anxiety you might feel when you've just somebody's just broken up with you and a life-defining relationship has ended, or the anxiety of a midlife crisis. Um, yeah, you could think about other ones too. I certainly don't mean this to exclusively apply to those, but I'm hoping those ones are ones that allow just about anybody to think, oh yeah, I kind of know what that experience is. Um, so I want to now just try to describe more broadly what I think characterizes the experience of anxiety. And as I said, I think I talked about being unsettled or not being able to be at home. I think that's the core of it. I think that there's a really basic way that when you feel anxiety, you lose a sense of being at home in the world. Indeed, it can feel like this is the end of the world. The world that you were living in just isn't happening anymore. It's not available to you anymore. But the interesting thing is that stuff is all still there. The world is all still there. What has happened is that it's basically been stripped of meaning. Uh, and I think the core of that is that nothing seems to matter. Uh, and part of what that means is you can't gear into anything. You can't become absorbed in anything. You can't sink into tasks the way you used to because they don't seem compelling and gripping in the way they did. You can't sink into tasks and lose your feeling of this anxious, uncomfortable unsettledness, much as you might like to. Sometimes people try to sink into tasks and they just can't. They can't lose this feeling. So, as I said, the situation where nothing seems to matter, and I guess it's also a situation where you can really feel like you can't do anything. And you might still think, yeah, I can tie my shoes, I can go to the grocery store and buy groceries. But one of the big senses in which you can't do anything is that you can't do anything relevant to this way that you're feeling about the world. In the same sense that you might think that nothing matters, or the way Heidegger puts it is that the world now has the sense of nothing. It's nothing. But yeah, you could have the sense that nothing matters. And then you can also have the sense, therefore, that there's no reason to do anything. There's nothing that motivates you to get up out of your chair or not. You can go through the motions of doing actions. You can correctly fulfill the aspects of carrying out a task, but you're not really acting in the sense that you're not really robustly embodying your choice in worldly activities. And because basically the world isn't calling you to do anything. Normally you're hungry and you think, oh, I better go eat. Now you might be hungry and you think, yeah, well, whatever. Um, Things don't draw you. They don't compel you and bind you the way they did before. And I think that part of what that is about is thinking back to these situations, these examples I gave, for example, the end of the relationship or the midlife crisis. One of the issues there is that you can feel like there's no future. In the case of the relationship, you defined your whole world by that relationship, and suddenly it's done. It's like, I have nothing to live for. Or in the case of the midlife crisis, all those things you wanted to do, like I wanted to establish my career, I wanted to learn this or whatever else, I wanted to be fit, whatever those things are. I mean, you may have done them by 45. And accomplishing the things you wanted to accomplish turns out that doesn't make your life bubble over with success. It's not like you got a prize and you got there. You still have to keep living, and you did those things, and they're a little bit empty from the point of view of fulfilling your life. And then especially if you look forward and all you can see is that you're going to die, it can really seem like there's no future, given that that's what's going to happen. Like there's no reason to go on. So that's, again, part of what it means to have things stripped of meaning. Like you can just feel like there's no future. But if there's no future, there's no present, right? Because since you have nothing you're looking forward to, nothing you're expecting, nothing that you're aiming at, there's no aspect of this situation that calls you to dive into it, to work towards that thing. So anyway, so that's my attempt to give a quick analysis of what I think was kind of the structure of the experience of anxiety, how the experience of anxiety is an experience of meaning. And it, in a way that almost sounds paradoxical, you would say the meaning of the experience of anxiety is basically that you experience things as meaningless. Nothing matters. So anyway, I hope that description sounds pertinent enough to everybody. To if you're experiencing anxiety, if you have or whatever, like I hope you think, yeah, that does a reasonable job of capturing what it's like to have that experience and what's going on in that experience. So like I said, we often think of that as a problem. Like it doesn't feel very good. I have been in that situation for sure. And you think, oh, how can I get out of this? Like it's not just a passing thought. It's a gripping, feels like a disease almost. Like it just feels awful. So yeah, we often want to get rid of that and think, how can I get back to feeling good the way I used to? Um, as I said, that's the way we often respond to it. I want to take up a different side, which is to say, maybe that experience is good, and I want to talk about how it can be a healthy experience and what it might mean. So, so now I want to look at that experience that I've just been describing. Assuming my description is reasonably accurate, I want to think about what that experience reveals about the nature of our experience in general. Um, so, because I think anxiety reveals something quite important about ourselves and about our relationship to the world. Um, so I think that in that sense, anxiety enables a kind of insight, and I ultimately want to say an insight that can be personally transformative. So about the insight. So let's think about what has happened in anxiety. Again, picking up on the description that I gave before about not being at home and so on, I think in anxiety, what has been interrupted is the smooth flow of the world. That's the experience you have, and that makes sense in the case of a breakup of a relationship. It makes sense in the context of the midlife crisis. It makes sense in the things I'll talk about in a minute, like some of the contemporary global problems that we face. Um, the smooth flow of things is what's no longer happening. And when you lose that smooth flow of things, you also lose the comfort of the stability of your own identity. So it's an uncomfortable thing. The stability that you relied on, the sense of the world you were used to, is what is gone. So in interrupting that situation and taking it away from us, it actually draws our attention to that normal situation. It kind of reveals what things were normally like. So what were things normally like before this interruption? Whether it's your putatively successful life before the midlife crisis, whether it's your married life or whatever before your partner left you, whether it's your situation before this global pandemic and being locked down and so on. There, you have a sense in those situations you have a sense of who you are that is intimately integrated with your sense of what the world is. Right? You think of yourself as, if we put names on it, lawyer, um, teacher, whatever. Those are names, but those are really names that sort of summarize a whole set of ways of interacting with the world. If I'm a teacher, it means I go to school, the classroom, I prepare my classes, I talk to these students, I grade these papers, whatever else. Your identity, it seems to me, is your sense of yourself is deeply connected with that way you're integrated into the way a worldly situation unfolds, the way a situation gets carried out, the way that you are responsible for taking care of a situation and so on. And when we have that sense of ourselves as, a teacher or a wife or a husband or whatever it is, all of those words we use to, if somebody says, what are you? Or if you ask yourself, who am I or what am I? You have all these words. Well, all of those words pretty much name a worldly situation. You might almost say a worldly game where you're a player and you have things to do. In those situations, in being a boyfriend, in being a lawyer, in being a store clerk, student, there's a very basic way in which how we're supposed to act is laid out for us. What the things are that we need to do is already there. So you don't begin each day facing a world that's a complete mystery where you say, what am I going to do today? What's supposed to happen? You already know what you're supposed to do. And you really don't actually feel yourself as having the experience every morning of choosing, I'll do this today, I'll do this today, I'll do that today. Rather, you have a sense that, there's a way the world works. I'm in this part of it and I got to do these things. And I want to underline that point for a minute. Well, I guess I want to underline 2 points there. One is that idea that our sense of ourselves is integrated with a sense of the world, which means that we experience it as largely laid out for us already, what we're supposed to do, which gives us a particular kind of comfort and reliability and stability. And the second point I wanted to make, the one I wanted to underline, is that um, we don't experience those things particularly as our choices, and I mean that in quite a strong sense. Like, we generally do grow up believing people are supposed to get married, or you're supposed to get a job and earn a living, or you're supposed to be successful, or whatever. Like that, there are. You may not grow up believing that you're supposed to be an engineer, but one or two more levels of abstractions, like be successful, get a good job, get married, dress nicely. There are these more basic parameters that um, we grow up believing, and we without even thinking about it, we tend to, and sometimes when thinking about it, we tend to believe, or at least to act as if that's just the order of things. You don't experience that as a choice. And therefore, when you get a good job, um, you're not just happy because of your paycheck or whatever else, or because of the rewards of the job. You're also happy because you got a check mark, right? We also feel happy because we feel like we did those things we were supposed to do. When you get involved in a relationship, like, you're probably happy because you're with that person, but at some level you're also happy because you did the thing you were supposed to do. Check. So anyway, that's enough. That's my quick attempt just to sketch out something about what our normal selves are like. Like, I think this is pretty true for just about everybody, that uh, except in rare circumstances, uh, we have a meaningful sense of ourselves by participating in a sort of world that's already organized for us. We take that order as normative, as the way things are supposed to be, and we measure ourselves by how well we do in it. And we don't particularly even think of ourselves as choosing. And by doing that, by living in that world of order, like, we actually feel pretty comfortable. We get used to living in that world by those terms, and then that's how we feel successful, or probably unsuccessful too. Anyway, so that's just a quick sketch. So what I wanted to say about anxiety is, like, none of that stuff applies. All of those things that seemed important to you, all of those things that defined you, suddenly don't seem important. Like, you just can't. Maybe I shouldn't say they don't seem important, but they don't seem enough to arrest and compel your experience, right? You're cut adrift. So, in that sense, in unsettling us, anxiety allows us to see something about what we're normally like, um, how we normally define ourselves, what sorts of things we're normally looking for, and so on. So that's the first thing that anxiety reveals. Now I want to say what the second thing is. What the second thing is that anxiety reveals. When you say that nothing matters, what that shows you is that mattering matters. Right? For you to feel alive and belonging to the world, you really have to be gripped by things. It really has to be the case that things are inside you and moving you. If they don't matter to you, then nothing matters. So mattering matters. But now, what is mattering? Mattering is a matter of mattering to you. Sorry, I just keep repeating that word, but, like, you have to care about things. Right? What that experience of nothing matters shows is that the key to the world being able to grip you is that you have to care about things. So that opens up a possibility for transformation in two ways. First, what it calls you to, or at least invites you to recognize, is that world you used to live in affected you the way you did because you let it matter to you, right? Because you cared about that. So let me try to make that a little clearer. I was saying before that we often act as if it's just the way things are, and, like, you got to get a job, you got to do this, you got to get married, etc., etc. And we treat those things as facts that just impose themselves on us. But we can see, in fact, that those are choices. Those are what we have chosen to care about. not chosen in the sense that we sat down one day and thought, oh, I think I'll care about this. It's probably a deeply unreflective process by which, or the process of how we were brought up and encouraged to think about things in a certain way and so on. But what was really happening in that process of our growing up is that we were deploying our care. We were deciding what we were going to let matter to us. So one thing that the experience of anxiety allows us to do is notice that those things that we took to be just a natural state of things that imposed themselves upon us was at a deep level actually a choice. And the second thing then is that in recognizing that mattering, caring starts with us, that can open us to new possibilities, right? It can, this is the really transformative thing, it can draw our focus back to the idea that it's up to us to care about what really matters. And so that's the last point I want to make in my sort of basic interpretation here. I'm going to say something else, but the point I want to make is that the real thing, more than anything else, that anxiety allows us to do is to have the experience that it's up to us individually. It's up to you individually. You're the one who's suffering anxiety. It's up to us to care about what really matters. And I think that's the real message of anxiety. And that's the primary reason why anxiety is a particularly healthy thing, because it is what makes possible and indeed encourages what I think is the most important recognition, namely that it's up to us to care about what really matters. So now I just want to bring that back to our experience of our world. I think that a lot of people around the world are living with a lot of anxiety. I mean, some people always have. So for some people, their world might not have changed a bit. They lived difficult lives in awful circumstances, and this is more of the same. The people who are feeling anxiety are the people for whom, I guess, they especially had a reasonably comfortable life that they took to be normal. So a lot of people, it's the people in the relatively privileged dominant class all over the world. And for those people, which includes me, and presumably includes most of you, if you're listening to this, for us, what has happened is that normal flow of things has been interrupted. And you see people asking right now in the context of this, in the general sort of, I don't even know what the right word is, but let's call it lockdown, because people use that word often quite loosely. But in this lockdown, when people have to isolate themselves, they ask, when are things going to come back to normal? When are stores going to open? When are we going to be able to travel freely? That kind of stuff. We want things to go back. And they say, when will things come back? And then you also hear other people saying, oh, it's never going to come back, and so on. So I want to think a little bit about that issue of coming back. But I also wanted to say, of course, it's not just that pandemic that has produced this pretty broad experience of anxiety. I think people were pretty anxious, becoming pretty anxious already, for some other really good reasons. The pretty awful governments that we see in powerful nations all over the world. It's pretty unbelievable how bad putative leadership is, and the horribly repressive and backwards and destructive policies that are being advanced, and that are reshaping nations, reshaping the globe, reshaping the lives of people in pretty horrific ways. That's very depressing. And people think, am I going to do anything about that? What's happening? And then even a step beyond that, just the unbelievable undermining of our natural environment, and the transformations on the planet, and climate change and so on, and thinking about how we're running down the capacity of our planet to sustain the kind of life we've had. And so it seems, so I'm going to pick out those three: the environmental crisis, the awful government situation around the world, and then this pandemic. These things seem to me to be all good reasons for people feeling pretty anxious. So it's in relationship to that I want to think about this expression about, can we go back? And I guess at one level, yeah, I think things will go back. uh, whatever happens, a few years from now, we're probably going to have pretty awful governments destroying the environment, doing a lot of other bad things. Um, there will be a kind of going back to normal, but you have the chance here to recognize a little bit what normal means or has meant. And normal has actually meant something pretty bad. Um, and to pick up on that point about anxiety that I'm trying to make, what you actually have is the possibility of not going back. And what that should mean is um, that you're not going to live the way you were before. Um, so, I was saying that anxiety gives us the possibility of understanding how our own sense of identity was integrated with the way that the world works. Well, that's how this anxiety allows you to recognize how much your familiar life was wrapped up in systems that you unreflectively were choosing to belong to, but that the life you were choosing for yourself by what you were letting matter to you was really your participation in a culture characterized by deep systematic, or I guess people like to say systemic racism, uh, pretty profound economic exploitation, and environmental devastation. Those things, this anxiety here allows you to reflect back on how the world you wanted to belong to, the parts that work nicely in your local little environment, are actually part of a much bigger thing. And that much bigger thing is not very nice. So I think that the greatest power of anxiety here, but also why it's really uncomfortable, is that it is a provocation to you to reflect probably more seriously than you ever did on what you're actually doing, what you have been doing in choosing the life you've been choosing and following the path you've been doing. And it encourages you, it gives you that anxiety is the invitation to you uh, to um, to choose the good, to make yourself someone who's going to care about what really matters, and to be someone who's going to live a healthy life in an unhealthy world, rather than trying to get check marks by the terms of that existing world. So I think here the this uprooting also gives you a lot of opportunity to notice powerful and important things like the Black Lives Matter movement, like the activism to resist various awful policies and practices of economic, environmental exploitation and devastation, um, to reflect more deeply in general on what critics have shown many times over, what is really involved in the kind of the kind of political system we have, that is a kind of liberalism married to global capitalism, and the problems of that. So I think that the anxiety that we should be facing, those of us in relatively privileged positions, the anxieties we should be facing, wrapped up with this question of where's our world gone and is it coming back, that anxiety should be for us a real opportunity to reflect on that world and to see the problems in that system and to see ways in which our ways of living, even though we try to be innocent, are actually complicit in those larger structures. And it invites us to really refresh our sense of that we can ask the question about what really matters, and to try to turn our lives and the decisions we make to focusing on that. So you're not going to stop the pandemic or eliminate bad government by a simple choice that you make. That's not on a scale that your actions can affect. But you can, within your local world, you can act well. And I think that's what should be the outcome of the anxiety that you might be feeling.